In a valley surrounded by misty mountains lay the town of Blackthorn. It was a place of old rules and silent footsteps, where the clouds seemed to hang low not just in the sky, but over the spirits of the people. The most powerful person for miles around was not a king or a mayor, but a judge. His name was Elias Graves, and he carried the law in his voice and cruelty in his heart. He was a thin man with eyes like chips of flint and a mouth that preferred sneering to smiling. He owned the finest house in town, a dark mansion that overlooked the cramped streets, and he seemed to own the people in it. Once every 10 years a most dreadful event took place in the town square. It was called the bride choosing. The poorest men in Blackthorn, those who owed debts or had fallen on hard times, were summoned to stand before the entire town. Then the unmarried women, often those without families or means to refuse, were made to line up beside them. Judge Graves would preside over the spectacle from his high wooden chair. He would command a man to pick a wife, right there and then, with no courtship and no permission asked. The offer sounded generous. Pick any wife for free, but it was a lie wrapped in a command. The judge never let them truly choose. He would always point to the woman he thought was the most undesirable, the one the crowd would whisper about. He loved the gasp of the audience. He fed on the shame of the man and the humiliation of the woman. It was his way of reminding everyone that he held their futures in his thin, pale hands. This is the story of one such bride choosing, a day that would change 2 lives forever and teach the town of Blackthorn a lesson about the true meaning of strength. Among the women who would be forced to stand in the line on choosing day was a young woman named Mara. She lived with her elderly aunt on the outskirts of Blackthorn in a small cottage that was often filled with the scent of herbs from their garden. From a very young age, Mara had understood that she was different. While the other girls in town seemed to grow delicate and slight, Mara grew tall. Her shoulders became broad and her arms and legs grew strong from years of hauling water, tilling the stubborn soil, and chopping firewood to keep their home warm. The townspeople, especially the other women, did not know what to make of her. They did not see the kindness in her eyes when she helped a lost animal. They did not notice the careful way she braided her aunt's thin hair each morning. They only saw what was on the outside. They saw her height and her strength, and they called her names. Children, repeating the words of their parents, would sometimes call her Mara the ox as she walked through the market. Women would whisper behind their hands, saying she was too big and too rough to ever find a husband. They believed a proper wife should be small, quiet, and fragile, like a porcelain doll. Their words were like little stones thrown at her heart. They did leave bruises, but Mara refused to let them break her. She would stand up straight, lift her chin, and meet the gaze of anyone who stared. She knew her strength was a gift. It had allowed her to mend a fence after a storm, to carry a sick lamb to safety, and to support her aunt when her steps grew unsteady. But in a town like Blackthorn, her gift was treated like a curse. On the morning of the bride choosing, a deep dread settled in her stomach. She knew with a terrible certainty what was going to happen. She would be put on display in that line. No man would ever choose her willingly, not in front of everyone. She was there to be the punchline of the judge's cruel joke, the one he would pick to punish some poor man. As she prepared to leave her cottage, she promised herself one thing: No matter what happened, no matter how loud the laughter grew, she would not let them see her cry. She would face them with her head held high, even if her heart was breaking. Inside, the man who would be forced to stand across from that line of women was named Kieran. Not long ago, he had been a farmer, and a proud one. His land was not large, but it was his. It was a patch of earth on a sunlit slope where he grew potatoes, carrots, and the sweetest strawberries in the valley. He knew every inch of that soil. He had turned it, planted it, and cared for it with his own 2 hands. His calloused palms were a map of his hard work, and he loved the quiet rhythm of his life. He would rise with the sun, tend to his crops, and rest his tired bones at night with the satisfaction of a day spent honestly. This peace was shattered by Judge Elias Graves. The judge declared a new tax. A punishment, he said, was for the town's protection. The amount was impossibly high, designed to be impossible to pay. A season of unexpected early frost had already made things difficult for Kieran. He could not meet the judge's demand. With a false show of regret, Judge Graves pronounced the law required him to seize the farm as payment. Just like that, Kieran's home, his land, his entire life's work, was taken from him. He was thrown off his own property, left with nothing but the clothes on his back and a burning anger in his chest. His punishment, however, was not yet complete. The judge summoned him to the town square on the day of the bride choosing. Kieran stood there, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. He was not poor by accident. He had been made poor by the judge's greed. Now he was being paraded like a beggar and ordered to select a wife he could not provide for, a constant reminder of everything he had lost. He felt the eyes of the town upon him, a mixture of pity and curiosity. He did not look at the women in the line. He stared only at the cobblestones beneath his feet, his jaw set tight. He believed the judge had taken everything from him that mattered. He felt he had nothing left to give, and certainly nothing that would make him a good husband to anyone. His future, which had once felt as wide and open as his fields, now felt like a dark, small cell, and this choosing was its locked door. The air in Blackthorn's town square was thick and heavy, a palpable stew of anticipation and dread. It was a peculiar kind of holiday, one where joy was a foreign concept and schadenfreude was the main dish served cold from the high chair of Judge Elias Graves. The sky overhead was a flat, unbroken sheet of gray cloud, refusing to grant the proceedings even a sliver of sunlight, as if the heavens themselves were turning a blind eye to the events below. The cobblestones, worn smooth by generations of feet, now felt the press of a restless crowd, their murmurs creating a low, buzzing hum that was the town's true voice. The square was flanked by the town's most important buildings, their stone faces stern and unforgiving. The courthouse, with its pillars that seemed to lean forward to better observe the spectacle, loomed largest of all. From its steps, the scene was laid out like a stage for a particularly unpleasant play. Banners, once bright but now faded to melancholic hues, hung limply from the eaves, their fabric occasionally stirring in a half-hearted breeze. The entire town had, it seemed, answered its compulsory summons. Shopkeepers had closed their doors early. Farmers had left their fields, and mothers held the hands of children who were too young to understand the cruelty they were about to witness. but old enough to feel the tense electricity in the air. They were all players in this drama, whether they wished to be or not, their presence a silent endorsement of the power that ruled them. At the precise hour, a door at the top of the courthouse steps opened. The murmur of the crowd dipped into a respectful, fearful silence. Judge Elias Graves emerged, a stark black figure, against the gray stone. His movements were slow, deliberate, calculated to maximize the moment. He did not hurry. He owned time itself in this square. His robes of a fine, heavy wool seemed to swallow the scant light. His face was a mask of placid authority, but those close enough could see the faint glint of excitement in his cold eyes, the slight upward tug at the corner of his mouth that betrayed the pleasure he took in what was to come. He was followed by two bailiffs, their expressions blank, their duty a shield against any personal feeling. He descended the steps with a funereal slowness and took his seat in the high-backed wooden throne that had been placed for him at the edge of the square. It was not his usual judicial bench. This chair was for spectacle, designed to elevate him literally and figuratively above everyone else. He arranged his robes, placed his thin hands on the carved arms of the chair, and swept his gaze across the faces of his subjects. The silence was now absolute, broken only by the distant caw of a crow and the nervous cough of a man in the back. The judge's presence was a cold weight pressing down on the crowd, stifling even the desire to whisper. A bailiff stepped forward, unrolling a scroll of parchment. His voice, trained to project in open spaces, rang out clear and emotionless. By the order of His Honor, Judge Elias Graves, Magistrate and Steward of Blackthorn, the decennial bride-choosing is now commenced. Let the eligible men of requisite circumstance present themselves. From the side of the square, a shuffling, miserable group of men was ushered forward. They were a portrait of dejection. Their clothes were worn and patched, their postures slumped, their eyes fixed on the ground. They were the indebted, the failed, the unlucky. Their poverty was their crime, and this was their sentence. They were lined up facing the empty space where the women would soon stand, a row of shame-faced prisoners awaiting their fate. Among them, Kieran stood out only for his posture. While the others seemed to curl in on themselves, he stood rigidly straight, his back a rod of defiance. He did not look at the crowd, nor at the judge's chair. He stared at a crack in the cobblestones between his boots as if it were a lifeline, his jaw so tight a muscle flickered in his cheek. His hands were still fists, shoved deep into his pockets to hide their trembling. Not from fear, but from raw, impotent fury. Another bailiff moved to the opposite side of the square. "Let the eligible women present themselves," he intoned. This was the moment the crowd had been waiting for. A ripple of excitement, ugly and voyeuristic, passed through them. Heads craned. The women emerged from the shadow of the courthouse, a line of vulnerability forced into the harsh light of public scrutiny. They were shepherded into place by a stern-faced matron, their steps hesitant, their faces pale. Some were very young, their eyes wide with terror. Others were older, their features set in resignation, having endured this humiliating ritual before. They were a collection of the town's overlooked and discarded daughters, sisters and orphans, their societal value deemed so low that this was considered a suitable end for them. And then there was Mara. She walked to her designated spot. Last in the line, her head held high. The whispers started immediately, a hissing undertone that spread through the crowd like a poison. Asterisk, look at her. So big. Stands like a man. What a shame. Poor thing. Asterisk, the words were meant to be quiet, but they carried each one a small, sharp dart. She wore a simple, clean dress that was clearly too short at the wrists and ankles, evidence of a growth spurt that had long since passed. She kept her hands clasped firmly in front of her, but she could not make them look delicate. They were capable hands, strong from labor. She focused on a weather vane on the roof of the blacksmith's shop across the square, fixing her gaze there, building a wall in her mind against the stares and the whispers. She could feel the heat of 100 pairs of eyes on her skin, but she refused to flinch. She was the object of the joke, and she knew it. Her role was to be the final, unchoosable option, the punchline reserved for the man the judge wished. To punish most of all Dot, the ritual began. The first man was called forward, a timid tailor who had lost his shop to a fire he could not afford to rebuild. He stood trembling before the judge. "Well, Harlan," Judge Graves said, his voice dripping with false benevolence, "a wife will be a comfort to you, a helpmate. Look upon these fine women. Which one will you have to share your misfortunes?" Harlan's eyes scanned the line desperately, lingering for a hopeful second on a small, nervous girl who looked as frightened as he was. Before he could speak, the judge's finger, long and bony, shot out. No, indecision will not do. A man must be decisive. You need someone sturdy. You there. The miller's daughter. Yes, you. She too. The miller's daughter, a woman known for a sharp tongue and a bitter disposition, scowled. Harlan's shoulders slumped in defeat. The crowd tittered. The judge had successfully paired two people guaranteed to make each other miserable. He gave a small, satisfied wave of his hand. Next. One by one, the men were called. Each time, the judge offered the same hollow invitation, the same cruel pantomime of choice. Pick any wife for free, and each time he would interrupt, override, and select for them. He paired a simple, kind-hearted woodcutter with a vain woman who looked horrified at the prospect of a life in a forest cottage. He matched a young, ambitious man who had simply been born into the wrong family with a woman 3 times his age. With each match, the judge's mood seemed to improve. This was his art. This was his symphony of control, and he was its conductor. He was not just assigning spouses. He was crafting little lifelong prisons, each union a new monument to his absolute power over the destinies of those he considered beneath him. Finally, only one man remained, Kieran. The crowd's attention, which had begun to wane, sharpened again. This was the main event. Everyone knew the history between the proud young farmer and the judge. This was personal. Kieran, the judge said, his voice losing its false warmth and turning to ice, stepped forward. Kieran did so slowly, his boots scraping on the stone. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes, burning with a cold fire, met those of the judge. There was no deference in his gaze, only a flat, unyielding hatred. Dot. The judge leaned back in his throne, savoring this. He made a show of looking Kieran up and down, from his worn boots to his angry face. Well, now, the farmer with no farm. Graves began, his voice loud enough for all to hear. A man with nothing to his name but the clothes on his back and the air in his lungs. And yet the law is generous. The tradition is kind. We will not let you face your struggles alone." He paused, letting the insult hang in the air. "You are entitled to a wife, a helpmate to share your profound nothingness." He spread his arms wide, a grotesque parody of generosity, encompassing the line of weary, anxious women. "Look your fill, boy," he sneered, the word boy chosen deliberately to diminish him. "See what charity Blackthorn offers you. Go on, pick any wife for free." The invitation was a slap, it was a taunt. Everyone knew Kieran had no choice. Everyone knew the judge would not let him choose. The words were just the wrapping paper on a box containing a live snake. Kieran's eyes flicked toward the line of women for the first time. He saw the fear, the resignation, the hope dying in their eyes. His stomach turned. He would not participate in this. He stood silent, his lips pressed into a thin, white line, refusing to play the game. The judge's smile widened. This was the resistance he had hoped for. It made the breaking so much more satisfying. "Cat, got your tongue? Or perhaps you are overcome with gratitude?" The judge mocked. "Very well. If you cannot decide, the duty falls to me. As your benefactor, I shall choose for you." He made a great show of studying the line, his finger tapping his chin. His eyes passed over the younger, prettier women, a feigned consideration. The performance was exquisite in its cruelty. He was making the entire town wait for the punchline they all knew was coming. "You need a woman of substance," he said, his voice oily with false thoughtfulness. "A woman who can endure hardships. A woman unaccustomed to finer things, as finer things are certainly not in your future." His gaze traveled down the line, slowly, deliberately, until it landed on its inevitable target. A wave of knowing laughter started to build in the crowd, but it was cut short by a sharp look from the judge. He wanted silence for his reveal. He pointed. His arm was fully extended, his finger like a blade aimed directly at her heart. Her. Asterisk, the single word echoed in the silent square. All eyes, every single one, swung to the end of the line. To Mara, a beat of perfect silence was followed by a volcanic eruption of laughter. It was not kind laughter. It was roaring, knee-slapping, cruel laughter. It was the release of tension the crowd had been waiting for. The judge's joke had landed perfectly. The man who had lost everything paired with the woman no one had ever wanted. It was too perfect. The laughter rolled over the square, a wave of derision and scorn. Mara felt the sound physically, like a blow to her chest. Her carefully built composure cracked. A hot flush of shame crawled up her neck and burned her cheeks. She wanted to disappear into the cobblestones. She wanted the earth to open up and swallow her whole. She forced her eyes to remain on the weather vane, but it had blurred into a meaningless smudge against the gray sky. The laughter felt like it would never end. This was her deepest fear, realized in its most public and brutal form. She was the joke. She was the punishment. But then something happened. Through the roaring in her ears, she became aware of a change. The laughter was dying down, not naturally, but because it was being choked off by confusion. People were stopping mid-guffaw. The crowd's attention was shifting away from her. She forced her own gaze away from the sky and looked forward. Kieran was moving. Asterisk, he was not hanging his head. He was not protesting. He was not shaking with rage. He was walking. He was walking. Toward her dot, his steps were not hurried, but they were purposeful. He moved through the crowd of gawking people, as if they were not even there. His eyes were locked on hers, and in them she did not see mockery. She did not see anger. She did not see resignation. She saw a strange, fierce clarity. The square was utterly silent, now the silence even more profound than before. The only sound was the scuff of his boots on the stone. Judge Graves's smug smile had vanished, replaced by a furrow of bewilderment. This was not part of the script. The condemned man was supposed to weep, to rage, to refuse. He was not supposed to walk calmly toward his sentence. Kieran stopped in front of Mara. He was close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, see the dust on his jacket, see the honest weariness on his young face. The laughter had stripped her bare, but his steady gaze felt different. It felt seeing. He did not smile. The moment was too grave for that. But he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a nod of greeting, but one of acknowledgment, of recognition. He did not take her hand with the flourish of a groom. He simply reached out his own calloused, work-roughened hand and took hers. His grip was firm, but not hard. It was steady. It was real. He turned to face the judge, and the stunned crowd, and the bewildered bailiffs. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and carried easily in the dead quiet. It held no joy, but it held no shame either. It was a simple statement of fact, a final, quiet act of defiance against the circus around them. Asterisk. Then she's mine. The silence that followed Kieran's words was a living thing, thick and heavy and stunned. It was a silence that swallowed the echo of the crowd's cruel laughter whole, leaving behind a vacuum of pure, uncomprehending shock. 1,000 eyes were fixed on the two of them, on their joined hands, trying to parse a scene that made no sense according to the rules of Blackthorn. The script, written by Judge Graves and performed by the town for generations, had been torn in half. The punchline had stood up and walked away with the joke. Judge Elias Graves sat frozen on his high chair, his thin lips parted slightly. The smug, triumphant expression had been wiped from his face as if by a physical blow, leaving behind a blank canvas of confusion that was quickly being painted over with a slow, creeping irritation. His fingers, which had been drumming a victory rhythm on the arm of his throne, now gripped the wood, the knuckles bleaching white. This was not defiance. Defiance he could understand. Defiance he could crush. This was something else entirely. Something that looked disturbingly like acceptance. It robbed him of his victory. He had aimed to bury Kieran in humiliation, but the boy had simply refused to lie down in the grave. A hot, prickling sense of frustration began to burn in the judge's chest. The spectacle was over, but it had ended on a note he did not compose. Kieran did not look at the judge. He did not look at the crowd. His entire world had narrowed to the woman whose hand he held. He could feel the roughness of her skin, the strength in her fingers, the faint, almost imperceptible tremor that ran through them. He held her hand not with the possessiveness of a groom, but with the firmness of someone anchoring another in a storm. He gave her hand one small, deliberate squeeze, a silent message meant for her alone. Asterisk, the performance is over. We are leaving this stage. Asterisk, he turned, still holding her hand, and began to walk. He did not hurry. He did not drag her. He simply moved with a purpose that seemed to carve a path through the utterly bewildered crowd. People instinctively shuffled back, creating a corridor for them to pass through. There were a sea of open mouths and wide eyes, their expressions a mixture of confusion, disappointment, and a dawning, grudging curiosity. The expected catastrophe had been averted, and they were left with a mystery. Murmurs began to rise again, but they were different now, quieter, softer. The laughter was gone, replaced by a buzzing hive of questions. Asterisk what just happened. Why did he do that? What does he see in her? Asterisk Mara moved beside him, her legs feeling like blocks of wood. She was operating on instinct alone, her mind a roaring static of residual shame and overwhelming shock. The heat still burned in her cheeks, but a new sensation was beginning to seep through the numbness, a sensation so foreign she barely recognized it. It was the feeling of a shield. Kieran's broad back was between her and the staring crowd, his grip on her hand was a tether to something solid in a world that had just spun wildly off its axis. She kept her eyes fixed on the space between his shoulder blades, using him as a guide, as a barrier. She did not look left or right. She did not see the curious faces, the women who now watched her with something that looked almost like envy, the men who scratched their heads in bafflement. She saw only the path ahead, out of the square, away from the eyes, away from the judge dot as they reached the edge of the cobblestones and stepped onto the dirt path that led out of town. The spell was broken for the judge. The ceremony, his voice rang out, sharp and brittle, trying to reclaim control. The paperwork must be signed. The union must be recorded. Kieran did not stop walking. He did not even turn his head. It will be seen to, he called back, his voice flat and devoid of respect, a dismissal tossed over his shoulder. The message was clear. The judge's part in this was over. He had set the wheels in motion, but he would not be driving the cart. They walked in silence, the sounds of the town fading behind them, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the long grass and the call of a distant hawk. The further they got from the square, the more the tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a new awkward heaviness. They were alone now, two strangers, bound together by the decree of a cruel man, walking into a future that was a complete and total blank. Kieran finally released her hand. The sudden absence of that anchor made her feel unmoored for a moment. He stopped walking and turned to face her properly for the first time. They stood on the dusty path, the vast empty sky stretching out above them. The silence stretched between them, vast and deep and filled with unasked questions. Mara could not meet his gaze. She looked down at her boots, at the dust now coating the worn leather. Shame, hot and fresh, washed over her again. He had saved her from the crowd, but he was still stuck with her. He had lost his farm, and now he was burdened with a wife everyone laughed at. Her voice, when she finally found it, was small, hoarse, from holding back tears. "You did not have to do that," she whispered to the ground. "You could have refused him. You could have borne his anger. It would have been better than this." She gestured weakly between them, a motion that encompassed the sheer impossibility of their situation. Kieran was quiet for a long moment. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the way she held herself, trying to make her large frame seem smaller. He saw the fierce pride warring with the humiliation in her downcast eyes. "I remember," he said, his voice low and steady. Last autumn, on the river road, Old Man Hemlock's cart had overturned. His grandson was pinned underneath. The wheel was on his leg. Mara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. She remembered that day. The frantic shouting, the old man weeping, the boy's white, terrified face under the heavy wooden cart. The men were there, Kieran continued, his gaze distant. Seeing the memory, they were shouting, pulling at the cart, but it was too heavy. They could not get enough purchase. They were planning to run for ropes, for more men, but the boy was crying that his leg was going to break. He focused his eyes on her again, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. And then you came. You were coming back from the market. You did not stop to talk. You did not ask questions. You just pushed through them, knelt down in the mud, got your shoulder under the edge of that cart, and lifted. He shook his head slightly, a look of pure awe on his face that Mara had never seen directed at her before. It was not a little lift. You lifted it. You held it. Just long enough for Hemlock to drag the boy out. Your arms were shaking, your face was red with strain, but you held it. You saved that boy's leg, maybe his life. He took a step closer to her. The judge pointed at you today, and he saw someone who was too big. When he said that is what I saw. I did not see a joke. I saw the woman who lifted a cart off a child. I saw shoulders strong enough to carry weight. I saw someone who does what needs to be done, without waiting to be asked. He let out a long breath. He has taken my land. He has taken my home. But he thinks he has given me a burden. I do not see a burden. I see the only person in that entire square who understands what it means to face something heavy and not look away. Mara stood utterly still. His words were not pretty compliments. They were not romantic declarations. There was something far more powerful. They were a recognition. He had seen an action she herself had thought nothing of, and he had seen the truth of her character in it. He had looked past the whispers and the names and seen her. The hot shame in her chest began to cool and solidify into something else. Something like strength. She finally met his gaze fully and gave a slow, single nod of her own. It was an acknowledgment, an understanding. There were no pretty words between them. There was only a silent agreement, forged in the crucible of a public humiliation and sealed with the memory of a simple act of strength. They were two people who had lost everything to the same man. The path ahead was unknown and undoubtedly difficult. But they were not looking at a burden. They were looking at a partner. Without another word, Kieran turned and continued walking up the path. After a heartbeat, Mara fell into step beside him. This time she walked with her head up, her eyes on the horizon, matching his stride. Path they walked led them high into the rocky foothills that cradled the valley of Blackthorn. With every step the air grew a little sharper, a little cleaner, carrying the scent of pine and cold stone, scouring away the last clinging remnants of the town's stifling atmosphere. The silence between them was no longer just awkward. It had become a space, a vast and empty room they were both standing in, unsure of where to put the furniture of this new forced relationship. They were two separate islands, and the judge's decree was the unstable, temporary bridge between them. Their destination was not a home. It was a concept, an idea of a place that belonged to Judge Graves only in the most technical, spiteful sense. He had described it as a wedding gift, his voice dripping with venomous false generosity. As they rounded a final bend in the trail, the gift was revealed. It was a patch of land, yes, but to call it a farm would be a cruel joke. It was a steep, south-facing slope, littered with stones that ranged in size from fist-sized to larger than a bread loaf. Thin, tough scrub grass clung to life in the scant pockets of dirt between the rocks. A few stunted, wind-whipped pine trees leaned precariously, their shapes bent by the constant push of the mountain wind. At the very top of the slope, tucked against a sheer rock face that offered meager shelter, was a structure. It was not a house. It was a shepherd's hut, long abandoned. Its roof sagged ominously in the middle, and the single window was a dark, empty hole. The door hung from one rusted hinge, groaning softly as the wind caught it. It was a place of utter desolation, a perfect monument to the judge's contempt. Kieran stopped. Mara stopped beside him. They stood for a long time, side by side, simply looking at the monumental task before them. The silence stretched. There were no words adequate. For the moment, the hopelessness of it was a physical weight. Finally, Kieran let out a long, slow breath that was not quite a sigh. It was the sound of a man letting go of his last illusion. He turned to Mara, his face grim but set. "There is a stream," he said, his voice practical, cutting through the despair. "I heard it on the way up. That is something. We will need water." It was not a declaration of love. It was not a speech about their future. It was a statement of fact. It was the first brick. Mara looked from the barren slope to the crumbling hut, then to Kieran's resolute face. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. "The stones can be moved," she said, her own voice finding its strength. "They can be used for walls, for a foundation." It was her first brick, placed right beside his dot, and so they began. That first day, they did not speak of being husband and wife. They spoke of immediate survival-level problems. They propped the door shut with the largest rock they could find. They gathered armfuls of dry pine branches to make a rough bed on the hard dirt floor, far from the dripping corner of the roof. They took turns drinking deeply from the cold, clear water of the stream, using their cupped hands as a cup. The days that followed fell into a new, brutal rhythm. They rose with the sun, their bodies stiff and sore from the unforgiving ground. Their world shrank to the size of their hilltop. Their conversations were a series of short, practical exchanges. "This rock is too big. We need to dig around its base. The roof needs stronger beams. I can cut those pines. The soil here underneath, it is not entirely bad. See? It is dark." They were a team out of sheer, desperate necessity. Kieran's knowledge was of the earth, of seeds and seasons and growth. He could look at a patch of dirt and know what it needed. He could plan. But his body, while strong, was not built for the raw, brute force this land demanded. Mara's strength was their engine. Where he could not budge a stone, she could. She could dig for hours, her powerful shoulders driving the shovel. She could lift and carry loads that would have broken a smaller person's back. He would lever a rock with a long branch, and she would be the muscle that tipped it free. He would hold a post steady, and she would be the force that drove it deep into the ground with the heavy maul dot. There was no time for embarrassment or modesty. They were two creatures engaged in a battle for survival. They were often dirty, always tired. Their hands, both of them, became a network of new blisters on top of old calluses. They learned each other's rhythms. He learned that she was quietest when she was concentrating on a difficult task, her tongue pressed between her teeth. She learned that he hummed an old, tuneless melody when he was working out a problem in his head. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the silent agreement they had made on the path began to grow into something more. It started with small things. He would wordlessly hand her the full water skin when he saw her pause to wipe sweat from her brow. She would gather an extra armful of firewood without being asked, knowing the nights on the hill were cold. He began, saving the less rocky sections of soil for the vegetable seeds he had managed to barter for in town, a precious handful of potential. She spent a whole afternoon patiently weaving a thick mat of reeds from the stream bank to hang over the doorway, blocking the worst of the wind. Weeks turned into a month. The sagging roof was propped up with new timber. A proper door, rough-hewn but solid, now hung on leather hinges. A small, stone-edged garden patch, cleared of rocks by their combined effort, showed the first brave green shoots of potatoes and carrots. It was a tiny victory, but it was theirs. One evening, they sat by a small fire outside the hut, eating a simple stew of wild onions and the first of the garden's greens. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air was cold, but the fire was warm. They were eating in their now customary silence, but it was a comfortable silence, earned by a day of shared labor. Kieran spoke, his voice quiet in the twilight. The judge thought he was giving me a wife who was too much trouble, too much work. Mara looked up from her bowl, her eyes reflecting the firelight. He gestured around them at the secure door, the mended roof, the neat stack of firewood, the faint green lines in the garden. He did not understand. He gave me a partner. Mara held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked down at her own hands, no longer just strong, but capable, useful, transformative. She thought of the cart she had lifted for the Hemlock boy. It had been a single, isolated act. This every day here was a continuous one. She was not just strong for a moment. She was strong for a purpose. He thought he was giving you a burden, she said, her voice soft but clear. And he thought he was giving me a man who would be ashamed of me. She looked back at him, at the honest weariness and the quiet pride on his face. He did not understand that he was giving me a man who would see me. They did not say anything else. They did not need to. The fire crackled between them, a warm, bright heart in the center of the world they were building together, stone by backbreaking stone. The judge's curse was, with every passing day, looking more and more like a strange and difficult blessing. They had started with nothing but a silent agreement and a plot of rock. Now they had a foundation. Years are not kind to everyone. For some they are like gentle rain, nurturing growth and deepening roots. For others they are a relentless wind, scouring away at what is already weak and leaving behind only barrenness. In the town of Blackthorn, time had been a howling gale for Judge Elias Graves. His hair, once a slick, dark cap, was now a wispy gray cloud around a blotched and balding scalp. His posture, once rigid with authority, was now a stooped and shuffling curve. The high-backed chair in the square sat empty, a relic of a power he could no longer wield. A new, younger magistrate from a neighboring town now handled the law, a man who found the old customs of Blackthorn distasteful and had abolished the bride choosing for good. The judge's downfall had been woven from the threads of his own greed. He had overreached, seizing one plot of land too many from a family with quiet connections in the capital. His rulings were investigated, his taxes deemed illegal, his wealth confiscated as restitution. The dark mansion was sold. He now lived in a small, damp cottage on the edge of town, sustained by a meager pension and the bitter broth of his own regrets. The townspeople who had once feared him now mostly ignored him. Their silence was a colder punishment than any jeering crowd could have offered. One afternoon, driven by a restlessness that was his only constant companion, he took a walk. His feet, as if guided by a malicious ghost, carried him away from the town and onto the old, disused path that led into the foothills. The walk was long and difficult for his old bones, each step a protest. He told himself he was just taking the air, but a darker, more curious impulse pulled him forward. He had to see it. He had to see the monument to his own cruelty, the place where he had sent the defiant farmer and the too big girl to be broken by poverty and isolation. He expected to find ruins. He expected to see the collapsed skeleton of the shepherd's hut, the land reclaimed completely by thorns and rocks. He expected a satisfying confirmation that his vision for their miserable future had been correct. As he rounded the final bend, he stopped. His hand, gnarled with age, came up to shield his eyes from the sun, and he stared. The sight before him was so utterly foreign to his expectations that his mind refused to process it at first. The rocky slope was gone. In its place were terraces, strong walls of stone neatly fitted together, holding back deep, rich beds of dark earth. From that earth grew row upon row of vibrant green plants. Potato plants were thick and leafy. Carrot tops formed a lush green carpet. Bean vines climbed up carefully built trellises, heavy with pods. Fruit trees, still young but healthy, stood in a sheltered spot, their branches promising a future harvest. A sturdy stone cottage with a solid, smoke-stained chimney stood where the hovel had been. Its windows were glazed with real glass that glittered in the afternoon light. The roof was thick with turf, from which wildflowers bloomed in cheerful defiance of the high altitude. A well-built fence enclosed a pen where a dozen plump chickens scratched contentedly in the dirt. The air hummed with the sound of bees and the gentle whisper of the wind through the green leaves. It was not just a farm. It was a place of abundance, of peace, of profound and quiet success. And then he saw them. They were working together near the largest terrace, just as they must have done every day for years. Kieran was taller, broader. In the shoulder, his face tanned and lined from sun and wind, but it was a face at peace. He was carefully staking up a tomato plant, his movements economical and sure. And there was Mara. She was carrying 2 buckets of water from the stream, suspended from a yoke across her shoulders. She moved with a powerful, easy grace, her back straight, her step sure. She was not the shamed, hunched creature from the square. She was a woman in her prime, strong and capable, her face calm and focused. She set the buckets down beside Kieran and said something to him. He looked up, and a smile broke across his face, a thing of such genuine warmth that the judge, watching from the shadows, felt a pang that was something like physical pain. Mara laughed in response, a rich, full sound that carried on the mountain air, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. She placed a hand on his arm, a simple, casual gesture of affection and partnership, and pointed towards something in the garden. Judge Graves watched them. He watched the easy way they moved around each other, a silent, well-practiced dance built from thousands of days of shared labor and shared purpose. He saw the way they looked at each other, not with the resentment he had prophesied, but with a deep and abiding respect. He saw the strength in her arms that he had mocked, the very strength that had clearly built this paradise stone by stone. He saw the determination in Kieran's eyes that he had tried to crush, the determination that had clearly planned and nurtured this abundance. In that moment, the last of his own bitterness crumbled to dust, leaving behind a hollow, aching understanding. He had not punished Kieran. He had not cursed him with a burdensome wife. He had given him the greatest gift one person could give another. He had given him a true partner. He had given him a woman whose strength matched his own, whose courage fortified his, whose heart was as deep and fertile as the soil they had won from the rocks. The judge had meant to bury them, but he had instead given them the very ground in which to build a life more prosperous and happy than any he had ever known. They had taken his worst act of malice and, together, had used it as their foundation. Their love and their tireless work had transformed his curse into a blessing, so potent he could feel its warmth from across the field. They had not just survived, they had flourished. And he, in his lonely, bitter cottage, had truly failed. He turned away, unable to bear the sight of their happiness any longer. He shuffled back down the path, a shriveled figure against the vast, beautiful landscape. He did not look back. He knew that he was leaving behind the one true and good thing his reign had ever accidentally created, a monument not to his cruelty, but to the power it could never ever defeat. The end